Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. I'm your host again, Niels Eichhorn, and today I'm going to the sunny state of Arizona with you guys, and we're going to do something uniquely new for the channel. We've done a lot of Civil War stuff already over the last couple of months. If you have followed the written interviews for a couple of years now, but for the first time, we're going to start branching out, which the channel will be doing more to Latin America. And joining me today is an old acquaintance of mine, Marco Cabrera Gezeric. He is an assistant professor of comparative cultural studies at Northern Arizona University, which we will establish is the nice part of Arizona and not the hot part like Tucson and Phoenix. But he has been to Phoenix quite a bit actually, because he got his all of his degrees. I just look here, BA in psychology and then MA and PhD in history at Arizona State University. But we are going to talk today about a book that I found extremely fascinating reading. Probably one of my top 10 books done so far on like the channel in various forms. The book is published with Rowman and Littlefield, The Legacy of the Filibuster War, National Identity and Collective Memory in Central America. So, Marco, first of all, thank you so much for taking some time this morning to join me. And let's dive into how did you come? Well, I guess I should say the first time I met you, you delivered a paper about, I think it was Cartagena in Colombia and sort of micronations or post-independent nations that never made it in Central South America. And um, now we got a book on memory. So how did that come about?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Niels, for having me, and thank you very much for the kind words in relation to my book. Of course, as always, these books are a work of love, and to receive any kind of praise is always, it's a little bit it hits
Deserved.
your ego in some way. So thank you so much. Um, how did I get into this topic? Well, there's kind of a very long answer, so I'm going to try to keep it short. The issue of memory actually is it's a personal issue because well, actually the Colombian Nobel Prize winner Gabriel Garcia Marquez actually once said that all writing is biographical. And
Mhm.
in my case, actually, I was not born in Costa Rica, not born in Latin America. On my mother's side, I'm German. I was born there, and but I moved to Costa Rica when I was very little with a father that was not Costa Rican either, Guatemalan actually in his case. So the interesting thing, of course, growing up in Costa Rica was that in some way, as a child, I adapted very fast and very easily.
Mhm.
But at the same time, none of my parents were from there. So that always gave me that kind of insider outsider kind of thing,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And to start to encounter this Costa Rican society, for example, the celebrations of Holy Week that really
Mhm.
impacted me because, of course, this was not something common when I was growing up in Germany.
Mhm.
And then not only that, very soon also the civic celebrations, like the
Mhm.
civic celebration of the national holidays, independence, and some other aspects, especially
Mhm.
the Filibuster War in Costa Rica is very important. And starting to learn this, but at the same time, again, being outsider allowed me to actually be critical while at the
Mhm.
same time being very close to the topic. So this is what brought me into the issue of memory, because of course, one thing is history, which is the events,
Mhm.
and the other thing that is very important is how do we decide to remember them? Because I could see some kind of contradiction, some kind of lack of consistency in some of the narratives that
Mhm.
I heard about all these events. And I was wondering, and why do you believe this? Why do you think this is the
Mhm.
right way to approach it? Why do you think that's the only truth and cannot be touched, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So of course it has to do with the social frameworks. Here I'm
Mhm.
talking about one of the most important theories that I use for my book, Maurice Halbach's, when he talks about the social frameworks that actually help to
Hmm.
develop collective memory. So that's actually my interest in memory. Uh, I always was fascinated by the filibuster war, and that kind of took me to the mid of the 1800s, but also to the idea of the construction of the nation.
Hmm.
Of course, national
Yeah.
identity. Why do we realize, or why did we decide that a piece of cloth with some specific colors
Hmm.
are worth dying or fighting for, right?
Right.
So these kind of things are connected to national identity. And the question, of course, okay, when were these nations created in Latin America? And of
Hmm.
course, I learned that a lot of them didn't make it.
Yeah.
So that was actually the topic that I was exploring when we met. But of course, that is really connected to this work of the filibuster war
Hmm.
and theoretical terms, of course.
Yeah. Wow. That's it's fascinating. And I think that's sort of a the insider outsider perspective is always an interesting one to have sort of, right? I mean, I returned to my home region and like, yes, I grew up in this region, but it's not quite home anymore because I've spent half my life in outside of it. So it is kind of an interesting opportunity to kind of see that and kind of look at what people in who lives there all the time kind of for them it's daily life. It's normal, and you kind of are like asking questions that they kind of never thought about probably in that. Um, so did your school, like kind of getting ahead of me a little bit with the questions, did your school participate in any of the filibuster
Of course.
events? And
We had to. That's
oh,
uh, actually the day that they celebrate now the filibuster war, April 11, was a holiday, but relative holiday. I mean, there were no
mhm.
classes, but you had to attend very early in the morning, and there were a series of anthems you had to memorize days before and sing them, patriotic anthems, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah.
And it was a big honor to actually be part of the parade.
Oh,
I'm actually, used to live in Alajuela, which is actually the second largest city in the country, very close to the capital city, actually.
oh.
And that's where actually the national hero is from.
Yeah, I
So
was
the
just gonna say that's Santa Maria.
exactly Juan Santa Maria, actually, the house where he was born and he lived, of course, the house is not standing anymore, but it was located just a block away from my school.
Oh my gosh.
So now it's a monument, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So you can see that connection. Of course, I was
yeah.
like, what is going on here? And for most of my classmates, it was very normal, but I was
Right.
pointing out at a lot of things. What is happening here and why is this so important and who is this guy, etc. So it was very important and honor to actually participate in the parade. So actually,
Yeah.
all the elementary schools participated in the parades, especially the ones in Alajuela. And the idea was to actually march all the way to the statue of Santa Maria, and then from there to march all the schools back to where the house of Juan Santa Maria used to be, right? So I tried several years until
Right.
finally, my last 2 years of elementary school, I was able to participate in a parade, and
Wow.
then in high school, I continued that tradition, marching, with the band and things like that.
Wow, I think that this raised so many questions in my mind of like, hey, why aren't there any pictures of you in the book?
No, you don't want those pictures.
It must like you gotta have pictures, right? Your parents must have pictures of you participating in those. That's and then you write a book about it. That's like it's almost like you said, history is personal, but in your case, it's really personal, right? Like, I mean, I can like with my first book, Liberty and Slavery, I can claim, yeah, there's sort of a personal connection because some of the characters grew up in my home region, but yours is
Mhm.
way more personal than that because you grew up, you got educated in the shadow of Juan Santa Maria.
There you go, indeed, and that was very familiar for me to see the statue all the time, to even play in the square where the statue is, which is
Yeah,
basically in downtown and things like that. But of course, I think that again, the insider outsider thing was that one that helped me get interested on why
right.
and where did this come from and who is this really this guy and why do we celebrate him and not somebody else, for example,
Yeah.
right?
Wow. Oh man. No, I'm really happy I brought you on for today. This is going to be so much fun. So we briefly talked, and this sort of challenging question that I had that a lot of people have. It's sort of like, what do you consider yourself, right? I mean, are you a Costa Rican historian? Are you a Latin Americanist? Do you consider yourself a 19th, 20th century memory, like political? What, like, like when you went out for jobs, like what were you applying for?
Right, right. No, definitely I'm a Latin American historian. That's my main hat, right?
Yeah.
Actually, my master's thesis was more like a 20th century thing. It had to do with the
Okay.
fall of
Hmm.
Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala.
Oh, yeah.
But for the dissertation, I decided to change the topic. And
Mm.
then that's when, as always, taking different classes with different
Yeah.
professors starts to inspire certain things.
Hmm.
I was lucky enough. One of my mentors actually specialized on collective memory,
Okay.
national identity. So I took
Yeah.
2 or 3 classes with her, Victoria Thompson, and that actually allowed me to for the first time I felt that it was not just reading history, but it was
Hmm.
about understanding history through the lens of a theory,
Hmm.
and therefore to play so become a real historian, right? To
Yeah.
apply a theory over these
Yeah.
events. So and I don't know, maybe that dynamism of this topic actually is the one that get me into this. But and of course, I started to think about what kind of topics can I talk about that
Hmm.
analyze national identity and memory studies. And I said, well,
Yeah.
let's go for the easy route. And it was not that easy at the end. Actually, it was way, way more complex. It was supposed to start as a little article, just
Mm.
explaining, how this national holiday came into being and how it was celebrated. And then I realized, wow, I didn't understand that there was all these
Mm.
complex local, regional, political forces, and then how much change in this little country, happened that I don't see it in other countries where the story of the creation of national
Mhm.
identity and national monuments and national heroes is more straightforward, right?
Yeah, and it's something that eventually I did in my survey courses in the States was U.S. history that I kind of was like, let's explore the history of the United States through this lens of remembering and in places in kind of different ways because it always felt more meaningful for the students to like think in terms of like how do we connect to this? How do we purposefully remember something versus like, oh, here's a textbook, remember these names, dates, and stuff. And
Hmm. Hmm.
but kind of related to that, when it comes to memory, well, actually, let me open the door for you to explain it to the listeners because, like, they have done. I'm sure many of them know kind of Civil War memory studies, and but it never really dives into the methodology and sort of the series that you do, which is sort of was really fascinating because you kind of takes the nationalism the works on nationalism and kind of look at them through this lens of memory studies like Hobsbawm and Imagined Communities with Benedict Anderson and so on. And it was really fascinating how you kind of crafted that methodology and returned to it throughout the book over and over and kind of used them to kind of explain like this is a frame, this is a theory, and here's how Costa Rica actually does exactly that.
Indeed, indeed. Maybe I should go a little bit into the different names and theoretical approaches I use and how they work a little bit in the book. I mentioned already Maurice Halbach's.
Hmm.
His work on collective memory is fascinating. And it's a very old work, but I think that he is able to synthesize something very important, which is the concept of individual memory taking
Hmm.
up to the collective and how this is created. I always like to use some kind of analogy, like to explain how collective memory is created. And imagine yourself, for example, living in a building, in a 4 story or something like that, and suddenly you hear a very strong screech, like a car breaking, and then boom, a
Hmm.
crash. And then you go to the balcony, let's say, and you see actually the 2 cars, in the accident.
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating, perfect. And then you go downstairs, then actually you start to ask people, okay, well, what happened, and you see one of the cars in the middle of the road and the other one crashing into it, and you immediately assume the logic, right? Okay, this guy was
Hmm.
crossing when he wasn't supposed to, and that happened. And then you hear somebody telling you, actually, no, this guy stopped there because he was something like out of gas, and this guy just didn't stop. So it was actually
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
fault of the guy that crashed
Yeah.
into the other one. the interesting thing is that this is something you heard.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody told you this.
Yeah.
And in 2 days, when you are in a bar with a friend, and then suddenly the conversation goes back, oh, did you hear about the accident? Oh, yes. You're going to repeat that story.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't see it.
Yeah.
You were not a witness, and still you're
Mm-hmm.
going to accept it. And then you're going to repeat that story to others. And that's going to become the official story of what happened. And
Yeah.
still you have no proof, no evidence of that.
Yeah.
That's how collective memory is created. It's only we all agree on something,
Mm-hmm.
even when we don't really have an evidence or because we need to create a
Yeah.
narrative to solve questions, right? And
Yeah.
that's part of what this book is about. Stories. We are made of stories. We are made of
Mm-hmm.
narratives. And so that's what is happening here is okay, why did the Costa Ricans decide to take this story
Yeah.
and change it so many times
Mm-hmm.
depending on their needs, right? So
Yeah.
of course I was thinking a little bit about when the filibuster war happened. This is just the last antebellum hurrah for the pro-slavery
Yeah.
states in the United States, right? So the war happened between 1855 and 1860. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I've been trying to think about the execution of William Walker in the beginning
Mm-hmm.
of the Civil War, if there is not such a connection there, and maybe actually, if there's not a big connection between the fall of the filibuster project in Central America and the beginning of the lost cause myth in the United States. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a strong connection there. But another
No. Yeah.
important thing is Benedict Anderson. You mentioned him as
Mm-hmm.
well, the idea of the imagined communities. And of course, the idea for these Costa Ricans that used to be part of Spain, that used to be
Mm-hmm.
part of the Central American Federation, and now what are we? And what are
Yeah.
the bases, the values,
Yeah.
the symbols that are going to
Yeah.
help us to create this
Exactly.
new identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you.
No, I was also just like, I mean, you also have Eric Hobsbawm, of course. I mean, this a big nationalism scholar. He kind of belongs in there, and so it's a really fascinating. But as you were talking, one of the things that came to mind was also the sort of notion, right, that um, the community creates this memory and forms it, and then reformulates it, and it alters over time a few times, and it's something that I think historians sometimes struggle with that don't do memory studies or don't kind of kind of look into it more seriously, is that what you have here is a historically based um, story, but it's what the communities make out of them, right?
Actually, that's an important thing because again, when we think about history, we think about the specific events and how people actually
Hmm.
got involved into that.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that from the point of view of the present, what we care about is the
Hmm.
values that we
Yeah.
associate with those events. Not only how they transform society, which of course they did,
Hmm.
but how they continue to transform society. That can only happen if that society decides to accept the values or reject the values that may happen too, that
Hmm.
were promoted by that event.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not only about economics, and this is of course very Lacanian,
Hmm.
psychoanalytic approach that argues that we are made of stories, that we
Yeah.
are made of narratives. Humans
Hmm.
are that we are that the structure of the brain is actually made by words. So therefore, we cannot understand even the events that happen without having some way to interpret them. So I think
Hmm.
that's the value of memory studies is extremely important.
Yeah.
And that's what we historians do. We interpret the events.
Yeah.
So memory studies is a different tool to interpret these
Yeah.
events.
Well, yeah, and it kind of has is the fun of the changes over time that we can look at as a result of it. But you also already kind of indicated the challenge with it a little bit because memory studies is, and I kind of thinking here like I'm an IB teacher today, international baccalaureate teacher, and in the global politics, there's always this leveling of like you might start on the local and then you go to the regional, to the
Mhm.
national, to the international, and to the global, and it exactly feels like that with yours too, where it's sort of like there is sort of the local narrative for the different towns, communities in Costa Rica, and then you go to the regional, you go to the national state level, and it's sort of these it's almost like an onion, right? You kind of have these different layers that you're dealing with in all of it.
Indeed, and that's something actually I was thinking about when I was writing this book and getting so much into these different theories of national
Hmm.
identity.
Yeah.
And I realized that actually there were several identities playing at the same time. And then, of course, I remember
Hmm.
again Halbach's talking about the different social frameworks. We
Yeah.
are not made of one single identity. We're made of
Hmm.
several different identities.
Yeah.
The church is one produces a certain kind of a communal identity.
Hmm.
Your soccer team is another community that you belong to, and so on, right? So I started to think about it, and definitely national identity is part of the myth that we build on ourselves and our
Hmm.
communities. But
Yeah.
we all have communal identities, we all have regional identities,
Yeah.
and even larger identities. As a Latin American, for example, we have these terms of the patria chica and the patria grande, the
Mm.
small fatherland and the large fatherland.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Costa Rica is my patria chica. Definitely, there is an identity.
Hmm.
But I feel this strong connection with most of Latin America, even when those countries are
Hmm.
so different from each other. And this is the
Yeah.
patria grande. And I can
Hmm.
feel it when I meet different people from Latin America and different parts of the world. We recognize that even when they are so different, that there's a
Yeah.
kind of a sense of community there. It's an
Uh,
easy way to connect to each other. At the
yeah.
same time, and I explore this in my book, there is the importance of the local.
Hmm.
In
Yeah.
fact, you read it, of course. The interesting thing is that a local identity, a local story, becomes a national story.
Yeah. Yeah. And we definitely want to explore that today a lot more. Just as a note for both of us, stay away from Latin American food in Europe.
Okay.
We had terrible luck with that in Austria. It was bad. What they
Yeah,
classified as Mexican.
I wouldn't do that. Sorry.
Yeah, I know.
No,
Maybe,
I'm that kind of person that if I go to one place, I want to try what the local thing, So
yeah, Schnitzel wasn't much better either, unfortunately, in Austria.
Mm. I can see
Um,
that.
I'm glad the Germans agree with me on the sauce thing that the Austrians did not like about me. Um, but let's see here. So I'm gonna assume that if my listeners don't know what the filibusters are, they can look it up. There's great books, yours included, but then Robert May has done some great work on that too, so they
Indeed.
can look up who William Walker and the filibusters and all those guys are. So let's get into the meat of things with regard to your stuff. And I'm going to start with the curveball because you have William Walker, you have Costa Rica in there. We're going to start with the William Walker movie. Because I kind of
Okay.
want to, I want to hear your opinion on that thing.
I remember seeing it actually in the theaters when
Oh
it
my
came out.
God, I'm sorry.
Oh
You
yeah.
spend money for that thing? I
Well, in
thought,
Costa Rica, they had to show it, of course, right?
oh, you watched it in Costa Rica.
Right.
How was the reaction to that there then? Even more so because,
Well, to be honest, the movie is very Hollywood-esque,
hmm,
and
totally.
and therefore it creates a lot of problems. But on the other hand, it kind of follows the main narrative of the story of Walker
Except for that
for the
last
end.
few minutes.
Well, there's a lot of anachronisms. That the end is
Yeah,
the most surprising, of course. But there are a lot of different things going on already that
yeah.
are really problematic. The film is interesting in the sense that it really approaches, the arrival of Walker to Nicaragua, why he arrived,
Hmm.
and even his battles in Rivas and Granada. Although, of course, there are a lot of lies as well. He lost in
Hmm.
the Battle of Rivas. In the movie, actually, he's shown that he's as he won the battle.
Yeah.
Another big problem, of course, he was from Tennessee. He was from the 1950s. He was a pro-slavery guy. To have African Americans in his army never happened. No way. That would have never happened. He
I
was very
think there
clear
was
about
like
that.
Hungarians and some Germans in that army, but yeah,
There
definitely not
were some
Americans.
48ers, actually, for
Yeah.
example. Like Henningsen, he was very famous. He fought in the revolutions of 48 in Hungary.
Hmm.
Later, he actually joined the Carlist Wars in Spain as well.
Oh
And,
wow. Oh, these
and
guys
yeah,
are just fascinating.
uh, a lot of them. Yeah, very interesting. So the movie, yes. that, of course, you have to understand the period. This is the late 1980s, so that the Contras war in Nicaragua was going on,
Hmm.
and I think that the director, what he was trying to do was to actually point out, okay, this is the first time that the United States is involved in Nicaragua. This has been going on for a long time, and of
Hmm.
course, he uses the story of Walker, which this happens every 5 years or 8 years. Somebody in the United States suddenly rediscovers Walker
Hmm.
and finds out how crazy this invasion of Central America was. And of course, they get fascinated. Really, we did that? Okay. And then have to write an article in a newspaper or a movie or a
Right.
novel or something. So he comes back all the time. It's a fantastic story.
Yeah. Yeah, and like, we're not going to spoil the movie for those who haven't watched it and want to now watch it, is what actually happens there at the end. But yeah, it is fascinating how this he just comes back every couple of years as like, oh, look who I discovered and how amazing, what crazy story he can bring. But let's talk, having that out of the way, let's talk about the name for a moment because you, as I mentioned before we started, there's some Spanish terminologies that I'm not capable of doing, but one of them is you kind of say that in um, Central America, it's oftentimes called La Guerra contra los Filibusteros. And you disagree with that Latin American or Central American terminology, and you created sort of your own terms for this.
Indeed, indeed. I find the names very problematic, and there are actually several names for this event, which is common from many other wars. You know, they have two or three names depending. Um, but I think it's very important to understand what are we talking about. So actually, the first time that this war had a name was actually Nicaragua. They actually called this war La Guerra Nacional, the National War.
Hmm.
The reason for that is that actually when Walker arrives to Central America, to Nicaragua, he's actually invited by one of the two factions that were confronting each other in a civil war in Nicaragua.
Hmm.
So he allies with one of the factions. And what happens is that at the end of this conflict, the two fighting factions join and realize, okay, no, we have to expel Walker from here.
Hmm.
And then they join and create this kind of a sense of national unity. And
Hmm.
that's why they call it the Guerra Nacional, because it's a war
Right.
that finally allows Nicaraguans to create a national
Ah,
government that is
yeah.
compromised or comprised actually of the different factions. So the word actually makes sense, but for
Hmm.
Nicaraguans. For
Yeah.
Costa Ricans, it doesn't make sense to call it a Guerra Nacional because it was a very different process.
Mm.
So the Costa Ricans start to adopt that name as well, but
Mm.
then they started to call it differently. They call it the Campaña Nacional, the national campaign,
Okay.
because it was a long
Yeah.
process, but so they changed it a little bit. They changed the name again. I have heard it also called the Guerra del 56, the War
Hmm.
of 56. Also problematic because they're reducing the whole war that lasted from 1855 to 1860 to two events that happened in 1856. We
Yeah.
can talk about those events because they are now national holidays. But it's fascinating how they reduce everything.
Mm.
And by the way, this is actually something I learned when I was in elementary school. Basically, everything that they talk about is the two battles that happened in 1856 and not the whole war. So it's also, even in that the official discourse kind of selects what to remember and
Hmm.
what not, right?
Yeah.
So I see that Guerra del 56, the War of 56 doesn't work.
Mm.
The most official one actually used as a title for a book by one of the most prominent Costa Rican historians of the 20th century. He called it La Guerra contra los Filibusteros, the war against the filibusters.
Hmm.
And I was thinking, it makes sense because that's how you can see it from the Costa Rican point of view.
Hmm.
This is a war that we are waging in order to expel the filibusters.
Hmm.
But the problem is, who is the main actor here? Who is the one that is starting the war? And
Mm.
that's why I challenge that and I call it the filibuster war, which actually has gained some acceptance. I have seen that term starting to be used in different venues.
Nice.
That doesn't mean that is the dominant. I mean, they're,
Well, yeah.
as always, competing discourses, right? But I
Sure.
think that this should be called the filibuster war because it's the filibusters that brought the war. They are
Hmm.
the ones that define the war.
Right.
It's not Costa Rica, it's not
Yeah.
Nicaragua, it's not Central America that the one that start. the war. I mean, you can talk about the two factions in Nicaragua fighting, but that would be a civil war, totally
Yeah.
separate from the filibuster
Right.
war. So I think that that's why I use that term because I think that it's important to figure out who is the one
Mm-hmm.
being the aggressor here
Right.
and who has that clear goal of what they want to do, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
filibusters, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah, no, exactly, right. And it's you can look at it, and I think that's oftentimes a problem from the US perspective. It's this presentation of again, I'm thinking sort of Robert Mace's work, and it's very much sort of like here's the story of the filibusters, Walker, and all these people in the US and Washington and Costa Ricans and Nicaraguans are sort of a side story to it all because it's like I mean, we can speculate. I personally think it's oftentimes language barrier and a bit of laziness at not going to Latin America and kind of doing the research for these types of projects.
Mm,
But it's nice. That's why I really enjoyed your book because you actually had the other perspective. You had the perspective of the locals that are fending off the filibusters. Um, so
indeed. I mean, all my respect for Robert May. I have read his books and they're fantastic. I think that in his case, I will forgive him for doing that because I think his approach he makes it very clear. I want to
yeah,
study the filibuster movement
yeah,
in the
yeah.
Southern slavery movement and all that
Yeah.
stuff. But this is a critique I have against most historians of the United States that actually talk about the war. And you can see it even in recent titles,
Hmm.
William Walker and such, and the filibusters in Central America. And it's clear that they want to talk about that.
Hmm.
And I have to say that there's a whole trend of romanticization of the filibusters as well,
Mm,
which tells
yes.
me a lot of about the writers, right? Why are
Right.
they presenting this in a kind of a romantic way?
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to bring, and a little bit
Hmm.
from the perspective of Latin America, but also
Right.
from the most common and accessible works, newspapers,
Hmm.
history books, so most like more like interpretation of all these events, right?
Yeah. Speaking of newspapers, that was fascinating where you kind of looked at and there were hardly any newspapers in Costa Rica, right? Like
At
that
that time, almost none.
yeah.
Well, we
That
have
I
to
did not
remember.
expect that.
Well, we have to remember that Costa Rica actually it's a country that actually became a republic in 1848.
Right.
There was a Guatemalan newspaper that covered all of Central America during the colonial
Mm,
period. And after independence, there were like two or three different newspapers that died after a few years. But
mm,
it was not until the republic was founded that the government finally consolidated and started to publish their own newspaper,
mm, okay.
followed by some kind of semi-official newspapers.
Right.
But there's also a problem of lack of readership. It's not
Hmm.
until the educational reforms of the
Mm,
1860s and 1870s
right.
that suddenly literacy in Costa Rica spikes. So it's
Mm,
fascinating. You can see it precisely on the boom of the newspapers from two or three newspapers that existed in the 1850s and 60s. Suddenly in the 70s, you have like 10, 20 newspapers
yeah,
going on
yeah. People
for
can
a
read.
very small population.
Mm. It's almost like Benedict Anderson is confirmed in everything you do for Costa Rica.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't think about it because I love that the theory of the imagined communities of
Yeah,
Benedict Anderson. But the idea of print capitalism, I think it has been criticized a lot because in some places it doesn't
yeah,
work.
yeah.
But you may be right. I have to rethink about this. Maybe in Costa Rica it may have worked.
Yeah, because that's, or at least it concurrently develops with each other,
Mhm.
right? That sort of the nationalism and the print culture kind of feed off of each other in kind of formulating the identity for Costa Rica. Oh, well, there we go. Next project.
Indeed.
But when you said like the the smallness, like the kind of the literacy problems and also the smallness of the country population wise, um, trying to think here. Did I publish the blog on this or not? I can't remember if I actually did because I kind of looked at Latin America briefly a little bit here and there. And one of the things that always struck me was sort of like you look at the American Civil War, right? And it's like 600,000 soldiers or like 1 million soldiers that are fighting. 100,000 in one army, 60,000 in the other. And then you look at Latin Americans, like army of 4,000 versus an army of 5,000. And it always felt like tiny, right? It's like tiny in comparison to these massive Civil War armies in the North. But then I think you mentioned like Costa Rica has a population of about 200,000 people. And it makes sense that you don't have the body count to do a large army in that case.
Actually, in the case of Costa Rica, at that time, it was smaller. It was 50,000 people in the whole
Oh my
country.
God. Yeah, I
Still,
mean,
we're still a small country. We're like
yeah,
about 5 million people, right?
yeah,
But at that time, it was 50,000 people, most of them concentrated in the Central Valley and the main cities.
yeah,
So actually far away from the borders.
yeah,
And if you think about it, also the filibuster army was small.
hmm
Some historians have tried to actually make calculate the numbers
hmm
according to all the migration records of all the filibusters and the different nodes that Walker had and all that.
yeah.
It seems that at the peak, Walker had about 5,000 soldiers in his army. And
Mm. That's huge, though, when you think of a country that has 50,000, right? That's 10% of the population.
well, actually, that's Walker in Nicaragua.
Yeah,
Costa Rica actually had 9,000 soldiers.
that's like 20% of the population under arms.
20% of the population and 40% of the male population. When I see these numbers, I start to recheck and recheck because I
Yeah,
was thinking, I don't think that even the Soviet Union had that many soldiers during World War II at one point, you know?
no,
I
like
mean, in
that's a
percentage
hugely,
time,
yeah, that's a
it's
hugely
massive.
militarized society.
Just imagine that the logistics, the
Yeah,
organization for this
that's a
army. Now,
total
of course,
war.
the army was spread around in different places, so there was never a battle of 9,000 versus 5,000. That never happened. Battles were actually some of the largest ones were like about 1,000 versus 800 or something like that.
Tiny. Hmm.
Still a
Yeah,
decent size, and that's without counting the rest of the Central American armies. Well,
right.
Honduras sent only like 200 soldiers, but El Salvador and Guatemala together they sent about 4,000 soldiers.
Okay,
So
wow.
for the population at that time, it was a massive movement in reality.
Wow. Yeah, wow. Tells me how much I have to learn about Latin America here. This is a crazy to kind of think about that.
The Costa Rican army also had something interesting because Costa Rica had been in had some tensions with Nicaragua in the late 1840s,
Yeah, yeah.
and there was a concern about a possible invasion. So actually,
Mm,
President Mora, who was the same president when the filibusters invaded, started to enhance the size of the army and also the training. He started to bring some Prussian and Polish instructors, for
hmm.
example, and
Yeah.
he connected with the United Kingdom and was able to get possibly the first. I
Oh,
forgot the
that's
name
the
of that
Enfield
rifle
rifle,
right now.
right?
Of the sorry, the
The
Enfield,
Enfield.
yes,
Yeah.
which was a Minier bullet rifle.
Yeah, that's
So
that's hugely marked up in my text of your book because
I
that was
think it's the second
fascinating.
place in the world where this rifle is used. I think it was used in Crimea first
Yeah.
and then in Costa Rica against the filibusters. So it's really
Well, yeah,
impressive.
because English the Indian Mutiny comes a year after that it starts.
Exactly.
So wow, yeah, no, totally.
It tells you a little bit about the importance that Mora gave to the army,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
luckily, because that's actually the modern weaponry, the
yeah.
instructions, and all that was that what allowed Costa Rica to defeat the filibusters.
Of course, then you have that central irony of the sort of the end of your book in a country that has no military today anymore.
That's actually one the first article I wrote because I was fascinated by that. And again, this
Yeah.
insider outsider thing, right? I was thinking about these celebrations, and
Mm-hmm.
then I look at the statue of Juan Santa Maria dressed in a military uniform, and of course he's remembered in Alajuela as a regular working class person. He used to
Mm-hmm.
actually have regular jobs like painting houses, running
Right.
errands from the barracks to other places, and so on. And I was thinking, interesting that we are celebrating a military guy
Mm-hmm.
instead of just a common Juan Santa Maria, because he was a military guy for 3 months.
Yeah.
And then I was
Right.
thinking, wait, we don't even have an army. We haven't had an army since 1948.
Hmm.
Why are we celebrating a military hero in a
Right.
country without an army, right? So that
Yeah.
that was kind of a part of what started to spark my interest in this. Okay, when did this start and has it changed? And it
Totally.
has. Since
Oh.
1948, I based this on analysis that an article of two Norwegian guys, and I'm going to destroy their last names, but I think it's pronounced Høvik and Az. I may be totally wrong, but they actually made an analysis about Costa Rican transformation in the society
Mm-hmm.
and when they can say it was a demilitarized country. And of course, as a Costa Rican, I'm thinking, yeah, 1948, the army
Right.
was abolished. We don't have soldiers anymore, and that's the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
No, of course not. Because the tradition of using,
Mm-hmm.
for example, military ranks stayed in the police until the 1990s. By
Okay,
then,
I
they
see.
started to drop these ranks and change the names, right?
Okay.
The kind of uniforms they use, they even had
Mm-hmm.
helmets at some point, the kind of weaponry,
Right.
and some other things. And that actually also was part of the celebrations of Filibuster War. During the 1950s and 60s, you saw some
Mm-hmm.
military bands playing military music.
Right. Even
And
though
then
there's
by
no
the
military.
no military, but
Right.
that militarization is still
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's not until the late 1980s and early 1990s that starts to change. And then you start to
Mm.
hear actually the school bands, which were dressed
Right.
like a
Yeah, yeah.
military kind of style, like in the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And marching and marches are military.
Yeah, yeah.
Suddenly changing and then playing suddenly a cumbia, a mambo, and I was like,
Right.
oh, this is interesting. It's fun, and you could
Mm-hmm.
see actually the people in on the streets that saw them
Right.
marching in a very solemn manner, starting to kind of dance, to the new
Yeah.
music and start to change. And the newspapers recorded that. One
Mm-hmm.
newspaper actually was so surprised because Costa Rica is a multicultural country, of course, and in the Atlantic zone, the majority of the population are descendants from people that came from the Caribbean islands to
Mm-hmm.
build the train, the
Yeah.
railroads, mostly from Jamaica, but also some other islands. And that culture is still very prevalent there,
Mm-hmm.
including the kind of music they play.
Okay,
So
so
one
now
of
it's
the
sort of like the cultural interchange of the music that's starting to come out again, and oh wow.
exactly, it's more tropical, more dancing, more
Yeah.
and that starts to transform things. And
Right.
if you go to any parade right now, the the baton, how do you call these? Usually the girls that go in front of the band, they have a baton. They
Yeah,
have a
I don't
name.
know.
I forgot.
I've never been in band.
Well, usually they did the
Yeah.
same things that they do in the United States. They throw the baton up
Yeah.
and then they do these kind of things. Not
Right. The
anymore.
marching. Oh,
Now they're not
they,
marching. If you see, they are dancing.
huh.
You can see
Okay.
the steps and they're dancing salsa, cumbia, mambo, and making this
Wow.
very tropical as if they were in a dancing
Yeah.
salon. It's fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes total sense, right, from what you said at towards the end of the book, that this transformation that is taking place, kind of modernizing the events out of this military conflict into something that's meaningful for this generation that
That's
hasn't
a key
grown up
word.
with it, right?
That's a key word, meaning,
Yeah.
because of course all these celebrations have a meaning
Hmm.
and they're supposed to carry some values.
Yeah.
The problem is that all societies are dynamic. All societies change,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, exactly.
therefore all these events that we are celebrating, all these sites of memory, kind of quoting Pierre Nora, they have to be transformed because the values of the society
Hmm.
transform. So you cannot stay with the same values.
No.
You have to kind
No.
of reread them if you want. You have to
Yeah.
transform them. And this is one of the results, is popular culture getting
Yeah.
into official culture.
Yeah, exactly. Even though sometimes you could ask, what is official culture sometimes in cases? But before we get there, there was
Okay.
one thing that you did mention in your earlier answer that I wanted to get back to because you kind of talked about the kind of different jobs that Juan Santa Maria had taken and sort of that he probably was for a working strata of some sort. And I kind of because we're talking Hispanic culture and Hispanic kind of society here in Costa Rica, it's a very stratified society I usually think of. And how does that kind of play into, I guess, first of all, this filibuster war, sort of the defense of the country, but then also when we think of like again going back to Anderson, him saying that it's a very kind of elite top-down imagining that takes place, and how does that sort of impact that you have sort of this commoner and the elite on top that kind of pulls him up and says, "This is the guy we're going to celebrate now."
That's a very interesting story. And that's actually what caught my attention the most when I was writing this. And I keep discovering more things that are not in the book anymore. Well, they're not yet, right? Maybe if I revise it, I will
Edition
add
two.
the version two, yeah, part two. So the story of Santa Maria as a national hero in Latin America is a little bit different, actually, not only from Latin America, but from the whole world. If you think
Hmm.
about it, most of the national heroes are presidents or generals.
Hmm.
Not in Costa Rica. The national hero
Yeah.
is a common soldier, and it's
Yeah.
possibly the first country that had a common person as the national hero. Now, in this, one of the
Yeah.
reasons may be because how Costa Rica was in the 1850s. First
Mm.
of all, there's a lot of talk about stratification and social differences and the casta system
Hmm.
in Latin America during the colonial period and all that. A lot of historians have tried to analyze why Costa Rican national identity may be a little bit different from other countries.
Hmm.
And one of the things that they found out is that Costa Rica is actually, even with the high standards of living they have now, and human index and all these other kind of standards that they always talk about, it
It
used
is
to be
gave
one of
by a
the
global politics students a nightmare.
actually it was one of the most isolated regions of the Spanish Empire and one of the
Yeah.
poorest.
I can see that.
And that's very important
Hmm.
because it was so poor that we basically did not have any kind of nobility during the colonial period.
Mm.
The amount
Okay.
of money that they were able to make was very little. Also,
Right.
they had very few slaves.
Yeah.
The indigenous population, we think because disease had been decimated as well, so they
Hmm.
could not use that many indigenous population as servants or as lower classes.
Yeah.
And then in most cases, they started to mix as well. So what happens is that we have a very small population in which
Mm.
everybody's basically related.
Right.
So you're not going to actually enslave your third cousin, right? Because your aunt during a birthday is going to say, "Hey, what are you doing?"
Yeah.
That's the son of Aunt Rita or whatever, So
As well
you
as
have to
coming after
behave.
you.
So that's the point. It complicates the situation in Costa Rica
Yeah.
so much that, and actually there's a book. Samuel Stone, actually, he was born in Costa Rica, but his mother was a very famous U.S. anthropologist, Doris Stone. And he wrote a book called The Dynasty of the Conquistadors. And he made an analysis
Mm.
of Costa Rican politics in relation to the three main conquistadors of Costa Rica. And he discovered that all presidents in the history of Costa Rica, including the current one, with the exception of two presidents, all of them are related. All of them descend from the same three conquistadors, and the families
Holy,
have intermarried.
holy cow.
So that tells you a little bit about the story of the elites. All the
Yeah.
elites know that they are related,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
they also know that the lower classes are kind of related.
Yeah.
And so going back to the story of Juan Santa Maria, first of all, Alajuela was a small town in a country of 50,000 people. This may have been what, 10,000 people, maybe? It's the second city of the country. Let's use that number just for the sake of it. So everybody knew who he was,
Right. Yeah.
especially because he was running errands from the soldiers in the barracks to,
Hmm.
I don't know, to the church, to the local
Yeah.
grocery store, to whatever. Everybody knows who he is.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So the interesting thing is that, and this is not in the book, but actually I have been talking to some local historians in Alajuela, and they realize that actually Juan Santamaria is connected to the elites. True, he's from the
Huh.
lower classes, but his mother used to work for the most influential family in Alajuela. So
Oh.
actually, the elites know these people.
All right.
And the presidents, and this is part of the book I'm talking about how the elites conform their governments during the liberal period of 1870 to the late 1880s. All these presidents are ruling from Alajuela. They are connected to each other, And
Hmm.
they're the ones that impose Juan Santamaria as the national hero, because in some way is saying if Alajuela has the national hero, it's because Alajuela is the most important place in Costa Rica, without being the
Yeah.
capital city still.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a matter of politics. That's where they're choosing Juan Santamaria.
And he's still good because he is part of implicitly the family.
And he's part of the family. So he worked
Gosh,
for us. We know
that's
him.
crazy. That is so crazy. Well, I guess it eliminates the one question that I was going to also ask. Is he
Which
real or
was,
not?
oh yeah, definitely. Although there have been some challenges against that, especially in the early 1900s. They found a book of the functions of the soldiers of the filibuster war,
Hmm.
and a priest, actually the chaplain of the army, had a record of all the people that died, and
Oh,
the name of Juan Santamaria shows up as somebody that died of cholera morbus. There was an
yeah.
epidemic of
Hmm.
cholera during those times, entering Costa Rica. So that is a big problem because I mean the audience
Yeah.
don't know this part of the story. We haven't gone into that, but Juan Santamaria becomes a national hero because actually he burns the fortifications where William Walker and his soldiers are
Hmm.
hiding, and that actually allows them to win the battle against William Walker. But
Right.
he dies by doing that. So the idea that in a book says that Juan Santamaria actually did not die during that battle, but days after, kind of
Mm.
makes the whole myth collapse.
Right, right. Because all of a sudden it's like Nazi heroes' deaths, kind of
Right.
defeating the enemy. It's all of a sudden like, oh, he's just like,
He's just
what
made
was
up.
he doing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it happens that later we find some more information. There were at least five Juan Santamarias because it was a common last name with a very common name. So
Yeah,
we
of
have them
course.
dying in
Yeah.
different places. But we have records, for example, of his mother, the one I told you that
Hmm.
was working for the elites,
Yeah.
asking for a pension because this was the only son that was able to work and he sustained the family economically. So now she doesn't have the son, so she's
Hmm.
asking for a pension. This is just a year and a half after he died. And she kind of describes how he dies.
Hmm.
And then, which is recognized that
Right.
Congress actually gives her the money. And then we have some witnesses, even one of the main generals of the army, that actually is the brother of one of the presidents of Costa Rica in the future,
Hmm.
in the 1870s. He actually wrote his diary. He mentions the soldier because, and curiously enough, he says, because we used to bathe together. There was a river crossing the city.
Mm.
And when it was really hot, all the kids actually jump into the river,
Hmm.
poor kids and elite kids. And this guy
Right.
remembers that. So he mentions, so we know that he existed, of course.
Okay.
But there was some doubt at some point.
Huh. It's always fascinating when you have those sort of those local legends, local figures that then become the national heroes. And but I now that you kind of told me a little bit of your background story, I I also find it even more self-reflective because you mention in the book in a couple of places the first people that actually talk about Juan Santa Maria. And it's all outsiders. It's all foreigners who come to Costa Rica, who reside in the capital for a little bit of time and hears these stories and singles this one individual out as the one that they should focus on. So it's, I guess the question in there is, did you feel kind of that connection to these historical figures from like, I think one of them was from Panama, or um, did that sort of just was it sort of a slip to put that kind of comment into the book?
I haven't thought about it, and I think that the thing that connects us is that the freedom that being a little bit foreign gives us.
Mm,
And this may be for the audience because, of course, Juan Santamaria was not recognized as a national hero for a long time. But not only that, the memory of the filibuster was hidden by the
hmm.
enemies of the president Mora, that was actually in charge of the army during the filibuster war.
Mm,
Again, these elites, although they were relatives, they were also interested in different political
hmm.
directions, but also different approaches to politics, who was in charge and all that. So what happens with Mora is that actually his brother-in-law uh, actually delivers a coup d'etat, so basically
Mm-hmm.
overthrows him.
Mm-hmm.
And then after an internal conflict, Mora is executed, which
Mm-hmm.
is the big scene of politics in Costa Rica. This never happened later, and people are still actually discuss about why they execute him
Mm-hmm.
on that, especially because he was a relative. So
Yeah.
when this new president comes to power, he obscures everything connected to the filibuster war. And the reason is very simple.
Mm-hmm.
If we are celebrating the filibuster war, we're celebrating Mora. We
Mm-hmm.
can't do that.
Man.
There's a national holiday celebrating the filibuster war. We have to eliminate it. And they did. Not
Mm-hmm.
only that, we have to eliminate any reference to Mora and the filibuster war.
Mm-hmm. Right.
For about 10 years, that happens.
Mm-hmm.
But during the celebrations of independence in 1864, a Colombian, well, he was from Panama, but Panama was part of Colombia at that time. Jose de Ovaldía, he was a political refugee because, of course, there were a lot of political conflicts
Yeah.
in Colombia. He escapes to Costa Rica, he's received, and then he's asked, because he's a very famous orator, to actually give a speech for independence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when he arrived to Costa Rica, he arrived to Alajuela.
Mm-hmm.
That's where actually he spent several years. And he realized that there was a very important story to rescue, which is the story of Juan Santamaria. Of course, since he was living in the houses of the elites of Alajuela, he has been, I'm
Obsessed.
sure, hammered with the story of
Mm-hmm.
Juan Santamaria every night at dinner, right? I'm
Hopefully
sure
not
this
every
happened.
night.
So, of course, when he gives this speech celebrating the independence of Costa Rica, he remembers. But remember, Costa Rica didn't fight a war of independence.
Mm-hmm.
But we fought a war for sovereignty, which was the filibuster war. And then he
Mm-hmm.
mentions Juan Santamaria and rescues the figure.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that in those 10 years is the only mention of Juan Santamaria.
Yeah.
And by the way, he does not make a single mention of President Mora. I think that he knew that
Mm-hmm.
I may be able to talk about Santa Maria, but if I mention Mora, they are going to kick me out of the country. So it's a little bit of that
Safety,
notion
personal
of being
safety.
a foreigner that allows me
Yeah.
to be a little bit different and do some things without being
Yeah.
judged as hard as if I'm a local, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's
Yeah.
part of what's going on here. The second case is almost 10 years later, 1873. And this is already when that elite that was anti-Mora is already gone.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a new elite that actually are concentrate their power in Alajuela. So these, of course, are people that President Guardia, who was the first one of these dynasty of politicians, was actually a hero of the filibuster war, but
Mm.
he actually was not a member of the elites.
Okay.
So he's the first one that is not a member of the elites that is actually going to be in power. So how do you legitimize your power? Well, with the use of force. He's a military guy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But what if I recover the memory of the filibuster war, make it that center of national identity? And of
Mm-hmm.
course, I fought in the filibuster war, so I'm a hero of the filibuster war. So it makes a lot of sense that I recovered that.
Mm.
So another Colombian refugee actually writes the first play in which the
Mm.
name of Juan Santamaria is used. The name of Mora actually comes back and some other heroes of the filibuster war, but Juan Santamaria is the first time that he is mentioned. And again, not a president, not a general, just a common soldier,
Yeah.
and he's being rescued. This tells us actually that there's a memory, a popular memory of
Mm-hmm.
Santa Maria in Alajuela,
Yeah.
that people are remembering this guy all the time, and that therefore it makes sense that if you live in Alajuela, because this guy Lleras, Jose Maria Lleras, also lived in Alajuela, is going to talk about Santa Maria.
Yeah. That's sort of the moment where you wish you had sort of a time machine or somebody discovers like this beautiful diary, right? That like what was April 11 like in Alajuela in like 1862 or in 1870
All right.
before kind of that hype, before he's sort of nationally recognized, right? Sort of like that would be so brilliant to kind of get your hands on that local narrative, that local story, to kind of get to that. That would be amazing.
Actually, that's part of the project as well, because I started to look on when April 11th started to be celebrated,
Yeah.
and I started to try to go back. And before it became the national holiday, it was
It
already
was
celebrated
local.
in
Yeah.
Alajuela. for a few years, but not in the 60s or 70s. It was a little bit later.
Okay.
But that's when I discovered that actually Costa Rica celebrated a different holiday to remember the filibuster war. And I was like, wait. We have two different holidays? Why did we change? Who wasn't behind this? And who actually created the first one? And who was in favor of eliminating
Mm.
this one and in favor of producing the new one? That I have
Yeah.
never seen anywhere else. I mean,
Yeah,
every
that
other country always has the same holiday for years and years and years.
right, right. And that was fascinating too, of like how, and I was just gonna go there actually. You opened the door and I'm gonna step through it. May 1st, the holiday for the filibuster war, or as the rest of the world calls it, May Day or Labor Day.
Labor Day. It's Labor Day in Costa Rica too.
Yeah, but it was also
And that's actually the
filibuster war
problem.
day.
That's how it started.
Yeah,
What happens is that we have several days that are important for the filibuster war. March 20, which has never become a real holiday, but people remember it here and
yeah.
there.
We'll
April
talk about that
11,
later.
right. April 11 is actually the day of Juan Santa Maria. So it's the national
Hmm.
holiday right now. But before that, it was May 1st. And the reason for that is that when the Central American armies corralled Walker in Rivas, they put a siege on him and his army. It's on May 1st, 1857, that he finally surrenders. That's the end of the war. So if you think about it, it's like the end of World War II, right?
Yeah,
That's the day you celebrate.
Victory
It's
Day.
still celebrated in Russia, right?
Yeah.
So it's the same day. So May 1st, therefore, is declared by the President Mora as the national holiday. It's celebrated for 2 or 3 years until he's deposed.
Hmm.
And then silence comes, there's no celebration.
Right.
So when Guardia comes to power and he wants to connect himself with the filibuster war and try to recover the memory,
Hmm.
he's the one that actually recreates May 1st in 1873. That's the first time
Hmm.
it starts to be officially celebrated. Now celebrated with a dinner, and he invites some
Right.
ambassadors. So it's very official, right? Very
Yeah.
elite.
Yeah.
But he realizes that he's gaining some support.
Hmm.
So the next years, he starts to ask for the flag of Costa Rica to be posted on all the government buildings and all
Hmm.
the whole country to remember people. This is May 1st. So in some way, this is the typical, as Antonio Gramsci mentioned, the dominant versus the subaltern
Hmm.
cultures, right? The dominant kind of creating a narrative that's going to go down into the common people. And
Hmm.
it happens little by little, people start to celebrate it. There are dances in some
Hmm.
places celebrating these and so on for several years until the 1880s, 1890s, that it becomes really that national holiday. It's
Hmm.
fascinating to read the newspapers and how some editorials actually
Hmm.
say we should not celebrate Independence Day anymore. We should actually move it to May 1st and celebrate that as our national holiday.
Hmm.
This doesn't happen, but
Right.
it tells you a little bit about the public opinion, where it's heading,
Hmm.
right? I think because the meaning is more relevant.
Yeah, and it's fascinating when you think about it, right? Like so many
Yeah.
Latin American countries, like you say in the book, or even North America, Independence
Mhm.
Day is a big holiday, but not for Costa Rica.
No, and the reason is because, again, Costa Rica didn't fight a war of independence. Second, Independence Day is how can I say it? An externally imposed holiday.
Because of the Confederation.
Exactly. September 15 is imposed by the Central American Federation because
Yeah,
that's the day in which the Act of Independence is signed in Guatemala City.
yeah.
But we have to remember the colonial system, the Spanish colonial system,
Hmm.
was very federative, if you want.
Hmm.
And in Central America, each town had a lot of autonomy. So
Hmm.
when the Act of Independence of Guatemala arrives to Costa Rica, that doesn't mean, oh, yes, we are independent. No. Costa Rica has to call representatives from each town to gather and decide if they want to accept
Hmm.
independence or not. So they do it in December.
Yeah.
And still, Costa Ricans don't celebrate December because when Costa Rica finally decides to join the Federation, September 15 is voted in by the Congress and that
Hmm.
stays. It sticks. But
Right.
I claim it's not a real Costa Rican national holiday.
Yeah.
And this is controversial in Costa Rica. If I say that, there are going to be a lot of people standing and saying, "What are you talking about?" and all that. But if you see it from that point of view, especially because at that time
Mm.
Costa Rica was thinking on joining Colombia.
Mm.
Finally
Oh, wow.
joined, he was thinking on joining Mexico.
Mm.
Then it finally joined Central America, and it became an independent republic until 1848. So
Mm.
there
Bit
it goes.
late,
That's the
yeah.
problem with September 15.
Yeah. Well, well, then of course you get some May problems, right? With sort of like
Right.
here's your elite that controls the wealth in the country, and here's your workers who are wanting to, in a Marxist sense, overthrow the elite, and of uh, like Paris Commune and anarchism don't help in the and all the
Indeed.
protests and strikes in the United States don't help with sort of that as sort of a peaceful holiday on May 1st.
And that's exactly what happens with May 1st. The late 1890s, after the Haymarket affair in Chicago,
Hmm.
the International Socialist declares May 1st as their
Hmm.
holiday. They try to promote that. And in Costa Rica, of course, by the late 1800s, there are already some labor movements, artisan unions, and some more
Hmm.
kind of unions are already in existence. And by the early 1900s, they start to gather more and more strength. They start to march actually in the capital.
Hmm.
That's still traditional. Every May 1st, the workers in Costa Rica still march. It's a national holiday, Labor Day.
Hmm.
But what happens is that the elites actually start to realize something. In 1913, which is the largest demonstration, the workers' demonstration in Costa Rica, of all these unions
Hmm.
claiming, labor rights and all that, it happens that the situation in Costa Rica and Central America and the Caribbean is very delicate. The
Hmm.
United States is expanding as an empire very fast.
Yeah.
By 1912, that same year, they actually invaded Cuba and
Hmm.
occupied the island. They invaded Nicaragua and occupied for 15 years.
Yeah.
So Costa Rica actually started to see the United States as a threat. Remember, this is also a period of development of some kind of Latin American nationalism with the writing of Ariel Rodó and some Jose Marti and some other works that are claiming for this clash between the Anglo-Saxon America and the Latin America, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, well, if you remember, actually, that's exactly what's happening during the filibuster war. It's a
Yeah.
clash between Anglo-Saxons and Latin Americans and their views of the world. And
Hmm.
in fact, this is not, I'm just not making this up. Actually, the term Latin America became popular in 1856 and 1857.
Filibuster wars.
There are,
Yeah.
there are two poets, especially a Colombian and a Chilean, that start to publish poems talking about Walker and the heroic defense of Central America against Anglo-Saxon expansion.
Hmm.
And they are the first ones to use the term Latin America. So you can see this,
Mm.
this is
That's
permeating the
fascinating.
situation. So basically, workers celebrating Labor Day on May 1st, that coincides with a filibuster war, realize, oh, actually, we are rejecting the
Yeah.
imperialism of the United States, which is what the filibuster war is about as well. And the elites are like, oh, we have to figure this out. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating because
Yeah.
the next year, there's a union created by the government that actually is going to celebrate on May 1st, not Labor Day, but Arbor Day. So you can see a very clear manipulation here to
Hmm.
start to divest the meaning of the filibuster
Hmm.
war in connection with the May 1st.
Yeah.
And by 1915, the Congress actually passes um, a decree that
Mm.
commemorates April 11 as the new holiday celebrating the filibuster war. Now, the two holidays are going to exist at the same time, but a matter of 10, 15 years later, because the government is not supporting the
Hmm.
celebration May 1st, basically it dies. And
Yeah.
April 11 is the one that stays. I haven't seen this in any other country. This kind of a
Yeah.
political uses of memory so blatant, and so open.
Yeah. Well, and also the sort of like manipulation of like, oh, somebody takes over this holiday, we're gonna just move it to another day. Like I guess you could make the claim in the US that they don't celebrate Labor Day on May 1st and have it in September, but it it's not the same really in that. So it yeah, total it just that was just fascinating in so many regards of like this relationship, but it sort of also brought to mind like you already mentioned sort of the emergence of U.S. or I guess the reemergence really, because of filibuster war is an imperial
Hmm.
outlook of the United States. The reemergence of the United States as sort of an imperial hegemon in the Caribbean basin. But it's not just the United States, right? It's like companies like United Fruit who also have that kind of like filibuster or imperial undertone to them. So, like, how much do the workers look also to these companies as sort of like filibusters that are coming to Costa Rica and like taking over land, taking over resources, and kind of like in their mind at least connecting themselves to these freedom fighters, for lack of a better term.
Indeed, actually, the term filibuster in Costa Rica became has a very clear meaning. If they accuse you of being a filibuster, it means you are either a traitor or a sold out, or somebody that prefers the empire than Costa Rica, right? It's a matter of sovereignty and national identity.
Oh wow.
Now, the United Company is a very interesting case, and again, it talks about how Costa Rica did things a little bit different.
Hmm.
Now, the United Company, of course, played very hard, especially in Guatemala and Honduras, right? With
Hmm.
millions of, sorry, thousands of people dead because their political maneuvering, right? And all that political instability, dictatorships, and all that.
Hmm.
In Costa Rica, of course, they started to manipulate the situation as well. At least they tried.
Hmm.
And then, in fact, the United Fruit Company is going to become the center of the most important labor movement.
Hmm.
And but different from Colombia, for example, where actually Gabriel Garcia Marquez talks about this in 100 Years of Solitude, of the massacring of workers in the United Fruit Company.
Hmm.
In Costa Rica actually became the most important moment for workers because it's a massive strike, and the United Fruit Company has to figure out what to do because the
Hmm.
government is not siding with the United Fruit Company as
Oh,
governments in other countries did.
right.
So here, basically, the United Fruit Company has to deal directly with the workers. And it's so successful, that strike, that actually in 1930, it allows for the creation of the Communist Party. Now, we call it the Communist Party. They didn't call themselves like that. It was the Workers and Farmers Party or something like that.
Hmm.
But
Right,
uh,
right.
but later, it was very clear that all the leaders were had a very strong Marxist approach.
Hmm.
Still not Stalinist, and that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
Kind of a very local version of communism. But anyway,
Hmm.
that's another story. The important thing is that these communist parties continue to use the idea of the filibuster war from there on to challenge the power of corporations. The United
Hmm.
Company, of
Hmm.
course, but some
Hmm.
others. There's one problem, though. Most of what they did was on ephemera, which are these flyers that usually archives don't collect. So we don't have most of that of those printings and information. There are a
Oh.
few here and there, but this is my personal memory. I remember seeing these posters on the light posts
Oh yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
protesting
Uh-huh.
against different corporations. Alcoa, for
Right.
example, the aluminum company of
Hmm.
America,
Hmm.
there was a massive protest against them in the 1970s, and the Communist Party actually took advantage of that and had a lot of posters
Right.
with a torch symbolizing Juan Santamaria attacking
Hmm.
Alcoa. So you can see that.
Yeah.
Also, the newspaper of the Communist Party is going to be very helpful, especially because there is a cartoonist, Hugo Diaz, that was published constantly in that newspaper. I think I published a couple of those cartoons in the book, and he constantly uses the image of Juan Santamaria
Yeah.
as kind of an anti-corruption symbol.
Mm. Hmm.
So every time that the government actually favors an international corporation, Juan Santamaria is there to protest. But it's also the one uh, pushing people to rebel against the corruption of the government in general and
Hmm.
things like that. So
Wow.
yes.
Wow. Again, you use the characters that you have available for your own benefits. Wow, crazy. Um, oops, wrong place. Now, let's just go to the third one because we have May 1st, we have April 11th. Now we need to go to March, and this is the commemoration of the Battle of Santa Rosa,
That's right.
and which is kind of like again, this is from all the things that you're saying, it's so fascinating, right? It's a country that has gone through a political civil war, 1948, um, decides to end the military, kind of sheds the symbolism, and then like just the way you tell the story of like how these old former military men come out and this like massive almost military veteran event takes place at where this battle had taken place, monuments being erected, and it's so counterclimactic, right? The military is gone, but we're celebrating looking like the military.
Actually, the whole conflict is I wouldn't say confusing, but very Costa Rican in its awkwardness. What happens is that actually in the 1940s, we have a new government.
Hmm.
One of the members of the traditional classic liberal elites, but educated in Belgium and with a strong influence on the socialist ideas of the church, right? The social
Hmm.
doctrine of the church. When he comes to Costa Rica, he becomes a reformist, very much in
Hmm.
the style of Roosevelt and some other typical of the 1930s
Hmm.
in Europe and the Americas. It happens that, of course, there's a lot of resistance from the more traditional elites. And he realizes that in order to win the second elections, he has to appeal to the most, how can I say, leftist groups.
Hmm.
And he allies with the communists. Not only that, the church, which actually the head of the church is also in favor of all the ideas of the social doctrine of the church, allies. This
Hmm.
is a very weird thing. The Communist Party allied with the church, allied with the liberals. That doesn't make any sense, but it's happening.
No. Huh?
It's happening
Enemy
because the
of my
three
enemy, I
groups,
suppose.
they are normal enemies, right? Because of all the liberal anti-church
Hmm.
agenda, right? And well, of course, the Communist Party
Yeah.
and etc. But it happens that three of them are interested in the same things,
Hmm.
which is the creation of a labor code, the
Hmm.
establishment of the 8-hour minimum, of a minimum wage, of all these kind of a socialist reforms typical of the
Hmm.
1930s and for pension system,
Yeah.
health system, all these kind of things.
Hmm.
Well, the traditional elites start to create a very tense environment in Costa Rica that finally ends with the beginning of the Civil War. It's a short-lived Civil War. It's damaging. I think there's still some trauma connected to that.
Hmm.
But it divided the country or polarized it into groups. So basically, those Calderonistas, which were the ones connected to the Communist and Church alliance,
Hmm.
and the Figueristas, Figueres became the leader of that more traditional group. So those are going to clash. So the United States is actually going to support the Figueristas, and they're going to win the war. The
Hmm.
interesting thing is that this guy Figueres, although he was an anti-communist, he was a social democrat.
Hmm.
So once he arrives to power, he's going to keep all the reforms
Yeah.
which the traditional elites were fighting against. He's going to keep all the reforms and even go deeper.
Right.
Doesn't make any sense, but it happened.
Yeah.
And he's going to abolish the army.
Hmm.
But the polarization exists. So all those Calderonistas, including Calderon Guardia, who was the president, leave Costa Rica. They are exiled.
Hmm.
So like I said, it's a very strong division, traumatic division in Costa Rica.
Yeah.
This guy that actually was allied with the communists goes to Nicaragua, and he receives the support of the dictator Somoza, Anastasio Somoza,
Hmm.
extreme right winger supported by the United States.
Yeah.
Again, what kind of alliances are happening here? Well, it happens that Figueres uh, is allied with Arevalo, the president of Guatemala, and they're starting a whole campaign of democratization of Central America and the
Hmm.
Caribbean. So they actually arm different groups to overthrow Somoza, to overthrow Trujillo and Dominican Republic, and some
Hmm.
other dictators.
Yeah.
So of course, Somoza is an enemy of Figueres because Figueres wants to overthrow him.
Right.
So again, the mafia thing, right? The enemy of my enemy is my best friend.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? That's what's going to happen. Somoza allies, supports militarily Guardia, the Calderon Guardia, and Calderon Guardia actually invades Costa Rica.
Hmm.
This is in 1955. The battle actually that defines the whole thing happens outside of the Hacienda Santa Rosa. Well, this Hacienda Santa Rosa was the same place in which Costa Rica defeated the vanguard of the filibusters exactly 100 years later. I mean, before.
Yeah.
So this
And I think
March
you said that
20,
they actually on purpose fought the battle on that day because they wanted that connection.
they wanted a connection, but
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, the first battle happened in March 20, 1856, and the filibusters are defeated. This is the first defeat of the filibusters during the whole war. So it's very important symbolically.
Yeah.
And it is in Santa Rosa in 1955 that this new invasion is defeated. Now, it's an invasion from the north, coming from
Hmm.
Nicaragua, to actually destroy the local government. So the association with the idea of the filibusters can be established.
Hmm.
It's not the same, of course, but
Yeah.
can be established. So the next year, on March 20, 1956, the 100th anniversary of the first Battle of Santa Rosa, Figueres actually thinking that he's a genius, he says, I'm going to celebrate 100 years later in Santa Rosa with all the veterans of this
Hmm.
battle. The problem is that inside Costa Rica, the opinions are still divided. Half of
Hmm.
Costa Rica supports Figueres, half of them support Calderon. And the problem is that they start to see this as a moment that we need to actually end this war, this conflict,
Hmm.
and start to create a sense of national unity.
Hmm.
And Figueres, by celebrating this battle and recovering the memory of Santa Rosa, he even proposes to create, and he does create a national park, to
Hmm.
create a monument there in Santa Rosa, and he wants to create a national holiday.
Hmm.
But the press goes after him very
Hmm.
hard and starts to say, if you do this, you're saying that you are the only winner and that you're going to decide what to do with Costa Rica, and this is not the moment for that. We need
Yeah.
reconciliation. So what normally in any other country will have signified a new holiday in Costa Rica collapses because it goes against the sense of national unity.
Hmm. That makes total sense. Wow. But yeah, it's just fascinating when you think of like that use of history for your current political purposes again, right? Again, going back to um your original argument. I'm kind of divided right now where I'm gonna take this towards the end because in part I'm kind of like the veterans op offer a lot of opportunities with regard to sort of like the thinking about like once veteran generations get older and die, it's sort of that it
Mm.
encourages commemoration more so because well, like we have to keep the memory of them alive. But I also was very interested by Stephen Palmer, and in my message to you, I called him a lightning rod. And like, I'm open. Which one do you prefer? Which one would you like to talk
I
more
can connect
about?
them actually.
Oh, okay, even better.
I can connect them. Stephen Palmer, in some way, inspired me to do this work.
Oh, wow.
I don't know him personally, so not him as a person, but
Yeah,
reading his work
yeah,
because actually his article on Juan Santa Maria was very revolutionary, at least in Costa Rica.
yeah. I can
He
see that.
actually, yes, he he actually was the first one to bring the idea of Juan Santa Maria, and I can't remember the title of his article, like the unknown soldier has a name in Costa Rica or something like that, which is
Mm,
fascinating because he starts by talking about the unknown soldier in France and some more things, also in the United States. But he says that actually this is an unknown soldier, but he has a name. We know
hmm.
who he is.
Yeah,
And he's a common soldier, but he represents the common people, but he's not a made up unknown soldier. We know who he is.
right.
So what happens is this: in 1855, the president of Guatemala, Justo Rufino Barrios, decreased the unification or reunification of all Central America.
Hmm.
Well, Honduras agrees. Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and El Salvador say, no, let's stop. So the president of Guatemala decides to send an army that actually crosses El Salvador and is moving south. Costa Rica and Nicaragua declare war against Guatemala. The armies are moving north, but then the president of Guatemala is killed in one of the battles in El Salvador in Chalchuapa, and that basically ends the war.
Mm,
Now, what is happening, and this is what Stephen Palmer talks about in his article, is that Costa Rica, in order to bring or unify the whole country to engage in this war against Guatemala, uses the figure of Juan Santamaria. And
Mm.
an article is published in the newspapers, in the national, in the government newspaper, talking about Juan Santamaria and the memory of Juan Santamaria. So again, talking about the common soldier defending the nation. So this is a
Yeah.
very easy connection, right? It's a common
Yeah.
soldier defending the country. So you should do the
Mm.
same. This is your example.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah.
And his argument is that that is actually the moment in which Juan Santamaria became the national hero and the moment in which the filibuster war was rescued and became the main or the core of national identity.
Mm.
And my research actually find out that that is not exactly true. That actually was more than 10 years before, in 1873, that President Guardia started to establish the basis for the recovering of the filibuster war's memory, and that the memory of Santa Maria with the play in
Mm-hmm.
1873 and with all celebrations has already come up.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in 1885 is not only this war, but what happens is that there's a new generation of people coming to power. Like I
Mm.
mentioned,
Yeah.
Guardia in 71 becomes president. He stayed president for a long time. He was a veteran of the war.
Mm-hmm.
His successor, who actually was his, let me see, brother-in-law, I told you these connections of the elites, uh, becomes an ex-president. He
Mm.
also was a veteran of the war, an officer.
Mm.
The third one, which is, let me remember what is the connection. The third one, Bernardo Soto, is going to be married to, I may be wrong here, I think the granddaughter of President Guardia. I'm trying to remember, but what were the connections? No, the daughter of the second president of Prospero
Oh
Fernandez.
my
So they're
gosh.
all connected, these elites.
Did you like draw like a diagram to kind of keep
I
straight
did
all
actually
this?
at some point, yes, because there's another president that is actually connected to the cousin of, I mean, this is fascinating, all these people, you know. Well, this guy Soto, he's very young. He's
Mm.
only 30 years old. He actually was born during the filibuster war. Therefore, he cannot claim that he's a
Okay.
hero.
Yeah.
But he's also a general, a member of the military, like his two
Mm-hmm.
predecessors. He is connected to those same families. He is connected to that dynasty because clearly they have been working together. Soto have been a minister in the
Yeah.
government of the other
Yeah.
two. So how can he claim legitimacy?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Well, by creating or consolidating, not creating because it was created already, the consolidating the figure of Juan Santamaria. So it is in 1885 that he decrees
Mm.
the erection or the construction of the statue to Juan Santamaria. He's the
Mm.
one that actually makes Juan
Right.
Santamaria a national hero. And again, the building of the statue is going to be connected to the elites of Alajuela, and he is
Okay.
quintessential elite of Alajuela. So I don't know. I think I have been able to connect these two things. And
Yeah, no, actually, it makes it even more fascinating because you're kind of now thinking of like Palmer because you're kind of like, why Palmer didn't dig deep enough, right? That he didn't see these earlier moments where Juan Santa Maria was already used and did only see like, oh, there's a statue, that's when it starts. And it's like, no, it was before that that it happened already. So it's,
yeah, I wonder. His initial work actually has is a comparison of liberalism in the late 1800s and
mm,
between Guatemala and Costa Rica. So this is the 1870s, 1880s,
right.
1890s elites. And I think that that's when he found the figure of Juan Santa Maria. I imagine, like I said, I never talked to him or anything,
Yeah,
that he saw the statue, he knows that he's the national hero of Costa Rica,
right.
and tries to establish when he was created as a hero. And
Yeah,
he finds this moment, which makes a
yeah,
lot of sense. Why he didn't
yeah,
go deeper? Well, sometimes we researchers,
yeah, we
assume
missed
that
something.
we find it and this is it, right? And
Yeah,
so I guess that's the reason.
no, curious. Oh, but well, that's always the benefit when you have the language capabilities, local connections that you can actually go and kind of explore that in more detail, right? And kind of like just like you found that pension request from the mother. It's like all these things coming together that just add up to create a more full picture. And that's, I guess, for students listening, there are still stories out there that you can research.
There is actually. I remember when we were talking about civil Palmer years ago, that actually I heard a colleague saying at some point, well, I think that everything has been reading about the filibuster war now. That was before I published my book, and I was like, oh, really? And right now, actually, I'm starting more research into another process that has to do with logistics and the filibuster war. And I realized nobody
Mm,
has written anything about it. So
no.
I'm like, okay, no, there's still a lot more to work on. Don't worry.
I'll have you back then in a few years' time. Wow, no, that's incredible. But I think we are at almost an hour and a half, and I said
Oh, wow.
we're gonna try and cap it at 12 for you, so we're almost at that, and we're probably gonna chat for a minute afterwards. So at this stage, then I'm gonna say incredible book, incredible story. There's a lot like I love memory studies these days. It's so fascinating to see kind of how history and memory and communities play into each other in that. So was a great book, Marco. It was a great book. Um, so thank you for letting me read it. Thank you for taking the time to chat and share this with the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Niels. And of course, I really appreciate your words for the book. And it was hard work, but also really fun because this is the kind of a research that you start to find more and more stuff, and you're like, really, really fascinating stories. And I didn't expect that. I thought it was going
Mhm.
to be just a regular, very straightforward story of any kind of a holiday, right? And I really appreciate, I have been seeing your work, of course, and I realize that you understand a lot about memory studies and nationalism, and to surprise or interest somebody like you is really, really cool.
Well, I'm always open for new stuff, and this was definitely really nice new stuff to, read about. Um, we need more of
Excellent.
this type. We need a lot more good memory studies of this nature.
Indeed. Indeed.